Forget everything you think you know about what happened last night. Forget the Pentagon press briefings assuring you that Israel intercepted almost everything and that the situation is under control. Forget the reassuring graphics and the carefully selected statistics that make catastrophic strategic transformations look like successfully managed operational incidents with high interception percentages printed in bold type. Forget the anonymous defense officials telling carefully selected journalists that this is a contained escalation within understood parameters that both governments are prepared to manage through established channels. What unfolded in the skies between Iran and Israel in the hours before dawn was not a symbolic military gesture, not a carefully choreographed exchange of firepower designed to allow both governments to save face without meaningful strategic consequences. What happened was the deliberate, methodical, and operationally precise dismantling of the foundational assumption that has protected Israeli national security planning for the last 4 decades. The assumption that Israeli airspace is effectively impenetrable to adversaries operating from Iranian territory has been retired. Not challenged, not stressed, retired. And the implications of that retirement extend in every direction simultaneously: military, strategic, diplomatic, economic, and existential, in ways that the official response machinery is specifically designed to prevent you from fully grasping before the narrative is managed into a shape that governments can politically survive. 300 ballistic missiles. Let that number settle fully in your mind before we go any further. Not 30. Not the handful that state actors typically fire as calibrated political warnings, weapons designed more to be intercepted dramatically and cited in briefings as evidence of successful defense than to achieve meaningful physical damage at carefully selected aim points. 300. And before the Israeli government or the American media finishes constructing the official narrative about how effectively the defensive systems performed, I need you to understand something that my years working inside military intelligence architecture make absolutely clear. Volume is itself a weapons system. The sheer number of simultaneous inbound threats is the weapon. When you saturate a layered defense architecture with more simultaneous trajectories than it holds interceptors to address at any given moment, you are not simply attacking with missiles, you are attacking with mathematics. You are forcing a specific and predictable outcome through arithmetic that no amount of technological sophistication can prevent once the inbound numbers exceed the critical thresholds that the defense architecture was designed and funded around. And the arithmetic of last night was devastating in ways that official statements are carefully and specifically engineered to prevent the public from fully grasping before the news cycle moves to the next manageable story. Having spent decades working inside the structure of military intelligence analysis, having sat across tables from uniformed officers who were mapping these exact saturation attack scenarios when Iran's ballistic missile program was still in relatively early development in the late 1990s, having watched the Iranian military build toward this specific operational moment step by step and investment by investment across 2 decades of systematic capability development that Western governments documented in classified assessments and then failed to translate into adequate deterrent responses, I can tell you with complete confidence that what Iran executed last night was not improvised emotional response to recent provocations. It was a carefully constructed operational plan developed over years, tested against simulations of Israeli defensive response patterns, continuously refined through systematic observation of Israeli and American defensive behavior across multiple previous exchanges, and executed last night with a wave sequencing precision that should alarm every honest defense analyst willing to examine the actual numbers without political pressure to manage the narrative toward a reassuring conclusion. Stay with me, because what I'm about to walk you through changes everything you have been told to believe about this conflict, about Iranian military capability, and about the regional military balance that has structured Middle Eastern security calculations for the past generation of strategic planning. The missiles Iran fired were not a single weapon type, not a single trajectory family, and critically, not a single wave. That is the first fundamental analytical error that mainstream commentary will make about last night, and it is an error that matters enormously to understanding why the results differed so dramatically from previous Iranian missile operations. When officials stand at podiums and recite interception percentage statistics, they are presenting a single static summary figure to describe a profoundly dynamic and deliberately sequenced military operation that unfolded in three distinct phases over approximately 35 minutes of continuous engagement. They are handing you a still photograph of a flooding river and asking you to believe it communicates everything important about the force of the current. It does not. The operational truth of last night lives in the attack architecture itself. And that architecture tells a story that is systematically more alarming than anything you will encounter through official channels. Iran launched what military planners refer to as a layered salvo. The first wave consisted primarily of Shahab-3 variants, the extended-range ballistic missiles Iran has been developing and systematically improving since the late 1990s. These missiles trace their technical lineage directly to the North Korean Nodong-1 design, itself developed with Soviet-era engineering assistance and refined through North Korean test programs across 2 decades of development. Iran took that baseline and spent subsequent years rebuilding the weapon family according to its own strategic requirements, redesigning guidance architectures, modifying propulsion systems, and engineering warhead interfaces for the specific operational scenarios Iranian military planners had been developing in parallel. The Shahab 3B and extended-range variants push operational reach toward 2,000 kilometers and carry warheads in the 700 to 1,000 kilogram range. They were never intended as the primary penetrating strike element. They were designed to saturate the upper tier of Israel's layered defense architecture, to force the Arrow 3 exoatmospheric interceptors and the David Sling medium-range batteries to engage aggressively and continuously to consume their available interceptor inventory against targets that Iranian planners had already calculated as acceptable losses in exchange for the substantially degraded defenses the second and third waves would then encounter. Before we go any further, I need you to understand the defensive mathematics that made last night's penetrations not merely possible, but essentially predictable to any analyst with honest access to both the attack architecture design and the real capacity constraints of the systems defending against it. Israel operates what is genuinely one of the most sophisticated layered missile defense architectures ever assembled and deployed. Arrow 3 handles exoatmospheric interception above 100 kilometers. Arrow 2 manages the endo-atmospheric engagement layer. David Sling addresses medium-range ballistic threats. Iron Dome handles shorter-range rockets. Each layer is genuinely capable within its engineering design parameters, and I am not dismissing Israeli defensive achievement because it is real. The problem is not capability. The problem is capacity. An Arrow 3 battery carries interceptors in the range of 40 to 60 rounds, depending on configuration. Israel operates a finite number of these batteries positioned to provide national coverage. When more than 150 Shahab-3 variants arrived on compressed simultaneous trajectories, those batteries expended interceptors at the rates their engagement protocols required. By the time the Khorramshahr 4 second wave arrived 8 to 12 minutes later on modified approach trajectories, the upper-tier magazine depth had been substantially consumed. In layered missile defense architecture, consumed upper-tier magazine depth means lower-layer systems handling tasks they were sized to supplement, not execute, independently at scale against an adversary that planned specifically for this transition. The Khorramshahr 4 that formed the second wave deserves specific technical attention because it represents a qualitative leap in Iranian precision strike capability that Western public analysis has not adequately credited, and that analytical gap just produced visible and costly consequences. Its operational range exceeds 2,000 kilometers. Its circular error probable has been substantially reduced from earlier Iranian missile variants through terminal guidance modifications developed over the past decade. Warhead payload configurations used in last night's second wave exceed 1,500 kilograms in yield. These were not weapons launched to make a political point while missing targets. These were weapons designed, targeted, and launched to hit specific structures and achieve specific physical outcomes at specific aim points inside Israeli territory. The third element, the Fatah-1 hypersonic glide vehicles, do not follow predictable ballistic re-entry trajectories. They maneuver during terminal descent. They stress radar tracking systems and fire control computation in ways that create genuine intercept geometry problems because the engagement solution changes continuously rather than being calculable from initial track establishment. When Arrow 3 batteries that had already committed significant fractions of their interceptor inventory to the first two waves were asked to engage maneuvering hypersonic targets, the outcome reflected physics and inventory reality rather than any failure of human performance. What the Pentagon does not want discussed at press conferences is that magazine depth is the single most decisive variable in saturation attack survival, and it appears least frequently in public missile defense discussions precisely because honest treatment of the real numbers makes the comfortable official narrative impossible to sustain. The most sophisticated interceptor ever engineered is a container holding a finite count of rounds. That count has a bottom. Last night demonstrated where the bottom was. Netanyahu was evacuated from the hardened command bunker. Let us be precisely clear about what that operational fact communicates because the Israeli government will invest considerable institutional energy shaping the narrative around this event into something less alarming than what the professionals who activated that protocol understood it to mean. The evacuation of a sitting head of government during an active ballistic missile attack is a security protocol. The activation of that protocol is made by professional security personnel using real-time data on inbound trajectories, actual intercept confirmation rates from battery operators, and actual residual interceptor inventory levels at each battery position. When those inputs cross the threshold at which the current protected location cannot be certified as safe at the required confidence level, the protocol activates. It activated last night. It activated because the professionals whose career and conscience depend on making that judgment correctly, using real data about what was and was not being intercepted, determined that the threshold had been crossed. Having been in rooms where these categories of decision are made, I understand what that activation communicates. It communicates that enough missiles had penetrated or were being assessed with high confidence as penetrating, that no fixed location in the threat zone was being certified as adequate. Keep watching because what I have not yet told you is where this event truly becomes dangerous in ways that extend far beyond the immediate military exchange and into territory that should concern every person following these developments. The strategic signal transmitted by 300 ballistic missiles cannot be understood by examining impact craters or parsing interception statistics released by governments with institutional interests in managing public perception. It must be understood in the context of what every government between Morocco and Pakistan and every general staff in Washington, Moscow, Beijing, and Riyadh now knows to be verified true about Iranian military capability and Iranian political will that they did not know with the same operational confirmation 2 days ago. The signal is this: the era of calibrated Iranian deterrence posture, the era during which Iranian strategic leadership calculated that threatening Israel and occasionally firing small symbolic salvos served Iranian interests better than actually executing the operational architecture those years of development were building toward. That era has concluded. The decision to authorize 300 missiles, to accept certain international political costs, to accept the high probability of American military response was not made casually. It was made because Iranian strategic leadership reached a threshold assessment at which the calculated costs of continued restraint exceeded the calculated costs of decisive action. That is a fundamental shift in the strategic calculus that has governed this region for 20 years. What the mainstream media will not tell you is how long the operational preparation for last night's attack was underway before a single launch team received its execution order. The logistics of a 300-missile coordinated attack involving three distinct weapon system families on precisely calibrated wave sequences, the pre-positioning of mobile launch units across Iranian territory in patterns that evaded satellite observation windows and avoided triggering early warning response procedures. The coordination of launch timing to achieve the saturation sequencing I described, the intelligence preparation required to develop precise targeting data for hundreds of individual aim points inside Israeli territory. This is not the product of 72 hours of crisis planning. This is the execution of a plan that was written, revised, war-gamed against simulated defenses, table exercised, and continuously updated over a period measured in years. Iranian military planners have been studying Israeli and American missile defense system behavior, battery positioning patterns, interceptor inventory management practices, and engagement response protocols through patient systematic observation for at least a decade. Last night was not improvised reaction. Last night was the execution of extraordinarily thorough and long-maintained operational planning. The consequences radiate in multiple directions. Immediate tactical consequences include the demonstrated physical penetration of Israeli airspace in volumes sufficient to achieve structural damage at specific target locations, the substantial consumption of Israeli upper-tier interceptor magazine depth that cannot be replenished in days or weeks, because these interceptors are not manufactured at high-tempo production rates, and the permanent psychological shift in Israeli civilian and political understanding of what national air defense actually guarantees under saturation attack conditions. Every Israeli citizen who spent last night in a shelter wondering whether the missiles would be intercepted now has direct personal experiential knowledge that the answer is not always. That shift matters profoundly for subsequent political and military decision-making in ways that official reassurance will not fully reverse. Regional consequences extend further. Every Arab government conducting a strategic reassessment, the deterrence relationships that structured regional security for 2 decades being recalculated in capitals from Riyadh to Ankara. At the great power level, the United States deployed carrier strike groups as a deterrent signal that failed. Not because American naval power is insufficient, but because Iran reached a threshold where it concluded the costs of action were preferable to continued restraint. The United States now faces choices between military response options carrying escalation risk toward broader regional war, or inaction that confirms to every adversary watching that American extended deterrence failed under sustained pressure. I wish I could tell you something more reassuring about where this leads. I take no pleasure in laying out analysis that points toward further escalation rather than resolution. I am obligated to tell you the truth as I see it, and the truth is that the variables needed to interrupt the current escalation trajectory are not aligning. The diplomatic channels that existed 3 days ago were already substantially degraded. The political conditions in Washington for absorbing the costs of visible restraint are deeply uncertain. The Iranian strategic calculation that last night's operation was worth its costs is unlikely to reverse quickly, given that the military objectives appear to have been substantially achieved. The decisions being made right now, in secured facilities in Jerusalem and Washington and Tehran, will determine whether last night was a singular operational statement or the opening movement of a sustained campaign with objectives that Iranian planners have been maintaining for years. The clock is running and the window for diplomatic intervention is closing in hours, not days. Watch the next 48 hours with the full attention this moment deserves. The strategic landscape that existed before those 300 missiles crossed that border does not exist anymore, and it will not be reconstructed by official statements insisting the defenses performed satisfactorily. Here is what actually happened behind closed doors in the emergency sessions that began in Washington and Jerusalem within minutes of the first missile alert sounding. The options laid before decision makers are more constrained than the American public understands, and the gap between what those decision makers know and what they are communicating publicly is substantial. On the Israeli side, the immediate military question is not whether to respond, but how to respond in a way that does not trigger the next escalation cycle in a sequence that Israeli military planners cannot currently model with confidence. The Iranian attack demonstrated capabilities that Israeli intelligence had been tracking, but that Israeli political leadership had been, if I am being honest, about what the classified assessments say versus what the public briefings have claimed, consistently underestimating in the operational assessments that shape force planning and diplomatic decisions. That gap between classified tracking and public political communication is the gap that last night closed violently and visibly. On the American side, the carrier strike groups in the Eastern Mediterranean are now tasked with a mission set that has changed fundamentally since yesterday morning. They were deployed as deterrents. They are now deployed in a deterrence-failed environment where their presence is calibrated not to prevent Iranian military action, because that prevention failed, but to deter Iranian follow-on action and to signal to Israeli leadership that American military assets are available for whatever retaliatory framework the United States and Israel agree upon in the emergency consultations that are ongoing right now. What those consultations produce will determine the next phase of this conflict more than anything else. And those consultations are happening in settings that produce no public transcript and no contemporaneous press account. The moral reality that I need to address, and that gets lost in purely technical and strategic analysis, is that behind every discussion of missile trajectories and intercept percentages and magazine depth calculations, there are human beings. There are Israeli families who did not survive last night in numbers that are not being fully reported in the initial hours. There are Iranian military families whose sons and daughters are operating launch systems for a government that made the decision to cross a threshold that produces these consequences. There are Lebanese and Gazan civilians who understand that what happened last night makes the political conditions for any near-term end to their own suffering essentially impossible. The tactical discussions and the strategic analysis are real, and they matter, but they must be conducted against the background understanding that what we are analyzing is not an abstract strategic puzzle. It is a cascading series of decisions by human beings that is producing consequences for other human beings that will shape lives and families and communities for decades. I have watched this pattern play out before. I have seen the moment when the accumulated weight of strategic decisions made over years produces a single acute crisis that arrives with a combination of speed and severity that political systems designed for slower-moving threats are not equipped to process in real time. And I have watched the response machinery attempt to manage the narrative of that crisis into a shape that preserves the political viability of the people who were responsible for the decisions that led to it. That management effort is happening right now. It will not change what happened last night. It will not restore the interceptor magazine depth of the Arrow batteries. It will not undo the psychological transformation in Israeli society. It will not reverse the strategic signal that Iran has transmitted to every government in the world about what Iranian military capability and Iranian political will actually look like when they are exercised without restraint. The world is different today than it was yesterday. The question that remains, and that the next 72 hours will begin to answer, is how different and in which direction, and whether the people with the power to shape that answer are willing to make the choices that the moment demands. There is one more thing I need to say before we close, and it concerns the people watching this from outside the immediate conflict zone who may be tempted to believe this is a regional problem with regional consequences that will be managed by regional actors without affecting their own security and stability. That belief is incorrect. The energy markets are processing last night's events right now. The shipping routes through the Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of globally traded oil and liquefied natural gas passes on a daily basis, are currently under a threat calculus that has changed materially overnight. The premium that markets will attach to that risk in the next trading session will be visible and substantial. The cascading effects of that repricing on inflation, on central bank policy, on consumer costs in economies from Europe to Asia, on the political stability of governments that are already struggling with the domestic political consequences of elevated energy costs. These cascading effects do not stop at the borders of the Middle East. This is not just about Iran and Israel. This is about the architecture of the international order that has governed global affairs since 1945 and whether that architecture can survive the test it is currently being subjected to. Watch carefully. The world is deciding something important right now, and most of the people in it do not yet know that the decision is being made.